Indigenous peoples, also known as First Peoples, Aboriginal peoples, Native peoples, or autochthonous peoples, are ethnic groups who are descended from and identify with the original inhabitants of a given region, in contrast to groups that have settled, occupied or colonized the area more recently. Groups are usually described as indigenous when they maintain traditions or other aspects of an early culture that is associated with a given region. Not all indigenous peoples share these characteristics. Indigenous peoples may be either settled in a given locale, region, or exhibit a nomadic lifestyle across a large territory, but are generally historically associated with a specific territory on which they depend. Indigenous societies are found in every inhabited climate zone and continent of the world. Since indigenous peoples are often faced with threats to their sovereignty, economic well-being, and their access to resources on which the cultures depend, a special set of political rights in accordance with international law have been set forth by international organizations such as the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, and the World Bank. The United Nations has issued a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples to guide member state national policies to collective rights of indigenous people, such as culture, identity, language, and access to employment, health, education, and natural resources. Estimates put the total population of indigenous peoples from 220 million to 350 million. Etymology: the adjective indigenous is derived from the two ancient Greek words indo equals endo, epsilon nu delta omicron, meaning inside, within, and genus equals, meaning birth, born, and also race. Etymology meaning native or born within. Any given people, ethnic group or community may be described as indigenous in reference to some particular region or location that they see as the traditional, tribal land claim. Other terms used to refer to indigenous populations are aboriginal, native, original, or first. The use of the term peoples in association with the indigenous is derived from the 19th century anthropological and ethnographic disciplines that Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines as a body of persons that are united by a common culture, tradition, or sense of kinship, which typically have common language, institutions, and beliefs, and often constitute a politically organized group. During the late 20th century, the term indigenous people began to be used to describe the legal category in indigenous law created in international and national legislation that refers to culturally distinct groups affected by colonization. James Anaya, former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, has defined indigenous peoples as living descendants of pre-invasion inhabitants of lands now dominated by others. They are culturally distinct groups that find themselves engulfed by other settler societies born of forces of empire and conquest. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of the continued existence as peoples, in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal system. The International Day of the World's Indigenous People falls on the 9th of August, as this was the date of the first meeting in 1982 of the United Nations Working Group of Indigenous Populations of the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities of the Commission on Human Rights. National definitions throughout history. Different states designate the groups within the boundaries that are recognized as indigenous peoples according to international and national legislation by different terms. Indigenous people also include people indigenous based on their descent from populations that inhabited the country when non-indigenous religions and cultures arrived, or at the establishment of present state boundaries, who retain some or all of their own social, economic, cultural and political institutions, but who may have been displaced from the traditional domains or who may have resettled outside their ancestral domains. The status of the indigenous groups in the subjugated relationship can be characterized in most instances as an effectively marginalized, isolated or minimally participative one, in comparison to majority groups of the nation-state as a whole. Their ability to influence and participate in the external policies that may exercise jurisdiction over the traditional lands and practices is very frequently limited. This situation can persist even in the case where the indigenous population outnumbers that of the other inhabitants of the region or state. The defining notion here is one of separation from decision and regulatory processes that have some, at least titular, influence over aspects of the community and land rights. In a groundbreaking 1997 decision involving the Ainu people of Japan, the Japanese courts recognized their claim in law, stating that if one minority group lived in an area prior to being ruled over by a majority group and preserved its distinct ethnic culture, or even after being ruled over by the majority group, while another came to live in an area ruled over by a majority after consenting to the majority rule, it must be recognized that it is only natural that the distinct ethnic culture of the former group requires greater consideration. The presence of external laws, claims and cultural mores either potentially or actually act to variously constrain the practices and observances of an indigenous society. These constraints can be observed even when the indigenous society is regulated largely by its own tradition and custom. They may be purposefully imposed or arise as unintended consequence of transcultural interaction. They may have a measurable effect, even where countered by other external influences and actions deemed beneficial that promote indigenous rights and interests. United Nations. In 1972, the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations accepted as a preliminary definition of formulation put forward by Mr. Jose R. Martinez Cobo, Special Rapporteur on Discrimination Against Indigenous Populations. This definition has some limitations, because the definition applies mainly to pre-colonial populations, and would likely exclude other isolated or marginal societies. Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those that, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on the territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing in those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of the continued existence as peoples, in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions and legal systems. The primary impetus in considering indigenous identity comes from the post-colonial movements and considering the historical impacts on populations by the European imperialism. The first paragraph of the introduction of a report published in 2009 by the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues published a report states for centuries, since the time of the colonization, conquest or occupation, indigenous peoples have documented histories of resistance, interface or cooperation with states, thus demonstrating the conviction and determination to survive with the distinct sovereign identities. Indeed, indigenous peoples were often recognized as sovereign peoples by states, as witnessed by the hundreds of treaties concluded between indigenous peoples and the governments of the United States, Canada, New Zealand and others. In May 2016, the 15th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues affirmed that indigenous people are distinctive groups, protected in international and national legislation as having a set of specific rights based on the linguistic and historical ties to a particular territory. prior to later settlement, development, and/or occupation of a region. The session affirms that since indigenous peoples are vulnerable to exploitation, marginalization, oppression, forced assimilation, and genocide by nation-states formed from colonizing populations or by politically dominant, different ethnic groups, special protection of individuals and communities maintaining ways of life indigenous to the regions are entitled to special protection. History. Classical antiquity. Greek sources of the classical period acknowledge the prior existence of indigenous people, whom they referred to as Pelasgians. These peoples inhabited lands surrounding the Aegean Sea before the subsequent migrations of the Hellenic ancestors claimed by these authors. The disposition and precise identity of this former group is elusive, and sources such as Homer, Hesiod, and Herodotus give varying, partially mythological accounts. However, it is clear that cultures existed whose indigenous characteristics were distinguished by the subsequent Hellenic cultures. Greco-Roman society flourished between 250 BC and 480 AD and commanded successive waves of conquests that gripped more than half of the globe. But because already existent populations within other parts of Europe at the time of classical antiquity had more in common culturally speaking with the Greco-Roman world, the intricacies involved in expansion across the European frontier were not so contentious relative to indigenous issues. But when it came to expansion in other parts of the world, namely Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, then totally new cultural dynamics had entered into the equation, so to speak, and once he's here of what was to take the Americas, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific by storm a few hundred years later. The idea that peoples who possessed cultural customs and racial appearances strikingly different from those of the colonizing power is no new idea, born out of the medieval period of the Enlightenment, European expansion and colonialism. The rapid and extensive spread of the various European powers from the early 15th century onwards had a profound impact upon many of the indigenous cultures with whom they came into contact. The exploratory and colonial ventures in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific often resulted in territorial and cultural conflict, and the intentional or unintentional displacement and devastation of the indigenous populations. The Canary Islands had an indigenous population called the Guanches, whose origin is still the subject of discussion among historians and linguists. Population and distribution. Indigenous societies range from those who have been significantly exposed to the colonizing or expansionary activities of other societies through to those who as yet remain in comparative isolation from any external influence. Precise estimates for the total population of the world's indigenous peoples are very difficult to compile, given the difficulties in identification and the variances and inadequacies of available census data. The United Nations estimates that there are over 370 million indigenous people living in over 70 countries worldwide. This would equate to just fewer than 6% of the total world population. This includes at least 5,000 distinct peoples in over 72 countries. Contemporary distinct indigenous groups survive in populations ranging from only a few dozen to hundreds of thousands and more. Many indigenous populations have undergone a dramatic decline and even extinction, and remain threatened in many parts of the world. Some have also been assimilated by other populations or have undergone many other changes. In other cases, indigenous populations are undergoing a recovery or expansion in numbers. Certain indigenous societies survive even though they may no longer inhabit their traditional lands owing to migration, relocation, forced resettlement, or having been supplanted by other cultural groups. In many other respects, the transformation of culture of indigenous groups is ongoing, and includes permanent loss of language, loss of lands, encroachment on traditional territories, and disruption in traditional lifeways due to contamination and pollution of waters and lands.